The rain lashed against the cracked pavement, filling the air with the rhythmic sound of water slapping against metal rooftops. The city never slept, but on nights like this, it certainly seemed as though it wanted to. The streets were nearly empty, the usual chaos subdued by the storm. Emily hugged her thin jacket closer, shivering as she hurried home from her late shift at the diner. She worked long hours for little pay, but it was enough to keep her tiny apartment and cover the bare essentials barely. Life had never been kind to her. Orphaned at 15, she had been bounced from one foster home to another, never truly finding a place where she belonged. By the time she aged out of the system, she was completely on her own. Some days she barely managed to scrape by, but, despite her struggles, she never allowed life to make her bitter. She still found kindness in her heart, kindness she rarely received in return. She was only a few blocks from her apartment when she heard it, a faint, desperate cry. Emily froze. The voice was weak, barely audible over the rain, but it was unmistakably human. She turned her head and saw a figure curled up near a bench at the bus stop. An old woman, frail and trembling, clutched her arms around herself as if trying to fight off the cold. Her soaked clothes clung to her body, and her hair, thin and grey, was plastered against her wrinkled face. Without hesitation, Emily rushed over. "Ma'am!" she called out, kneeling beside her. "Are you all right?" The woman looked up with tired, fearful eyes. Her lips moved, but no words came out. She was shaking, her body barely able to withstand the cold. Emily didn't waste another second. She shrugged off her own jacket and wrapped it around the woman's thin frame. "We need to get you somewhere warm," she said, helping her up. I don't know where to go," the woman whispered weakly. Emily's heart clenched. She wasn't sure what had happened to this poor woman. Had she been abandoned, forgotten, lost? "You can stay at my place for the night," Emily offered without thinking. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry." The woman hesitated, looking at Emily as if trying to figure out if she was real. "You would do that? For me?" Emily smiled gently. "Of course." She wrapped an arm around the woman's shoulders and slowly guided her toward her tiny apartment. The walk back to Emily's apartment was slow and cautious. The old woman leaned heavily against her, her frail body shivering despite Emily's efforts to keep her warm. When they finally reached the rundown building, Emily pushed open the door, guiding the woman inside. The apartment was tiny, just a single room with a small kitchen in the corner, an old couch and a bed pushed up against the wall. It wasn't much, but it was all she could afford. "Sit down," Emily said softly, helping the woman onto the couch, grabbed an old towel from the closet and gently draped it over the woman's shoulders. "Let me make you something warm," Emily said as she moved toward the kitchen. She rummaged through her small pantry, eventually finding a packet of instant soup. It wasn't much, but it would do. As the soup heated up, Emily stole a glance at the woman. She was staring at the apartment, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Are you feeling any better?" Emily asked, handing her the soup. The woman took the bowl with trembling hands. "Much better, dear. You are very kind." Emily smiled. "No one deserves to be left out in the cold." A strange silence filled the room. The woman sipped her soup slowly, her eyes dark and thoughtful. Emily felt something shift in the air, an uneasiness, like the feeling of being watched. Finally, the woman spoke. "What's your name?" "Emily. Emily Carter." The woman nodded slowly. "And you live here alone?" Emily hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, it's just me." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "You remind me of someone," she murmured. Emily tilted her head. "Oh?" The woman gave a small, unreadable smile. "A girl I once knew. She had a kind heart, just like you." Emily felt a strange sense of familiarity in the woman's gaze, but she brushed it off. "Well, kindness is free," she said lightly. The woman chuckled softly, but there was something strange in her expression, something calculating. "You don't have family?" the woman asked. Emily shook her head. "No, it's just me." The woman stared at her for a long moment, then finally spoke. "You helped a stranger tonight, Emily. That's rare in this world." Emily shrugged. "I just did what anyone else would." The woman set down her soup bowl. "No, dear, not anyone." There was something in the way she said it that sent a chill down Emily's spine. She tried to shake it off, but deep down she couldn't ignore the feeling. Something about this woman was not what it seemed. And by morning, Emily's world would change forever. Emily woke up to the smell of something unfamiliar, freshly brewed coffee and warm toast. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. She hadn't had a proper breakfast in weeks. Then she remembered. The old woman. She sat up quickly, rubbing her eyes. Sunlight streamed through the cracked window, illuminating her tiny apartment. And there, standing in her small kitchen, as if she had lived there for years, was the old woman. She had changed into the dry clothes Emily had given her last night, and she looked different, stronger, more alert. Emily blinked in surprise. "You're up early." The woman turned, a warm smile on her face. "Good morning, dear. You were so kind to me last night. I thought I'd return the favor." She gestured to the small table where a plate of toast and a steaming cup of coffee sat waiting. Emily hesitated. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," the woman said simply. "Come, eat." Emily sat down, her stomach growling. She took a bite of the toast, her eyes never leaving the woman. Something about her felt different, as if she was no longer the fragile, helpless person from last night. "So," Emily said between bites, "do you remember where you live? Maybe I can help you get back home." The woman's expression darkened. "I do remember," she said slowly. Emily perked up. "That's great. I can call someone for you." The woman's gaze softened. "There's no need. Someone will come for me soon." Emily frowned. "Are you sure? Who's coming?" Before the woman could answer, a loud bang echoed through the apartment. A knock, no, a pound at the door. Emily jumped up, startled. No one ever came to her place. The old woman sighed. "Ah, that must be him." Emily's heart pounded as she walked hesitantly toward the door. "Who?" Before she could finish, the door swung open, and standing there, dressed in an expensive black suit, was a tall, striking man. His face was sharp, his presence overwhelming, and his eyes, piercing, calculating, froze Emily in place. He didn't look at her. His gaze was locked onto the old woman. "Mother." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Mother?" The old woman smiled. "Hello, my son." Emily's world spun, because standing in her tiny, crumbling apartment was Alexander Blackwell, the billionaire CEO, the most powerful man in the city, and she had spent the night unknowingly helping his mother. Emily stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat as the realization hit her like a speeding train. Alexander Blackwell. The name was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just any billionaire, he was the billionaire. The ruthless CEO of Blackwell Industries, a man whose face was on every business magazine, whose name was whispered in admiration and fear. He built an empire from nothing, known for his cold, calculated decisions. And his mother had spent the night on her couch. The air in the room turned thick with tension. Alexander's sharp blue eyes flickered over Emily for a brief second before settling back on his mother. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice controlled, but there was an undercurrent of concern beneath it. The old woman, his mother, smiled gently. "I am now, thanks to this young woman." She turned to Emily. "This is the girl who saved me." Emily felt a lump in her throat. Saved. It hadn't been much. She just couldn't leave an old woman out in the rain. Alexander's gaze snapped back to Emily. This time he actually looked at her, really looked. His expression unreadable, assessing. "You helped my mother?" he asked. Emily swallowed, feeling small under his intense scrutiny. She was lost. I couldn't just leave her out in the cold. A long silence stretched between them. Then, to her utter shock, Alexander's cold expression flickered just for a second. He nodded slightly. "That was unexpected." Emily frowned. "Why?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "People don't do things like that for free." Something in his words stung, but before she could respond, his mother chuckled. Not everyone sees the world like a business transaction, my dear. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek, black checkbook. With swift precision, he tore out a blank check, scribbled something on it, and extended it toward Emily. "For your kindness," he said simply. Emily blinked. Then she looked down at the check and almost choked. $500,000. Her hands trembled as she stared at the ridiculous number. Her entire body went cold. Was this a joke? $500,000 for what? A cup of soup and a couch? I can't take this," Emily stammered, shaking her head. "It was just—" "You can," Alexander interrupted, his tone firm. "And you will." Emily gaped at him. "I don't want your money." For the first time, something flickered in Alexander's expression, something close to disbelief. His mother smiled knowingly. "You see, Alexander? Not everyone can be bought." He exhaled sharply, slipping the check back into his pocket. "Then what do you want?" Emily hesitated. "Nothing. Just take care of your mother." For a moment, Alexander Blackwell looked completely lost, as if he had never met someone like her before. And that was the moment everything changed. Because Emily Carter had just caught the attention of the most powerful billionaire in the city, and Alexander Blackwell never let things go. The tension in the room was suffocating. Emily could feel Alexander's gaze locked onto her, sharp and calculating, as if she were an equation he couldn't quite solve. His mother, meanwhile, watched the exchange with quiet amusement, sipping her now lukewarm tea. Emily's heart was still racing from the absurdity of it all. Just last night, she had been struggling to find enough spare change for groceries, and now one of the world's most powerful men had offered her $500,000, and she had refused it. Who in their right mind does that? But Emily knew if she had taken that check, she would have been selling something far more valuable, her dignity. Alexander exhaled, rubbing his temples as if trying to make sense of her. "You don't want the money, fine." His voice was calm, but Emily could sense something else beneath it, curiosity. "Then tell me, what do you want?" She squared her shoulders. "I just wanted to help your mother, that's all." Something flickered in his expression, something almost unreadable. But before he could respond, his mother chuckled. "I told you, Alexander, not everything in life is a transaction." Alexander shot his mother a sharp look but said nothing. Instead, he turned back to Emily. "If you won't accept money, then I have a different proposal." Emily hesitated. "What kind of proposal?" He slipped his hands into the pockets of his perfectly tailored suit, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Come work for me." Emily blinked. "What?" "You need a job, don't you?" Alexander continued smoothly. "One. That pays well, offers stability, and gets you out of this." He gestured subtly around her tiny, crumbling apartment. Emily felt her jaw tighten. "I already have a job," he arched an eyebrow. "At a rundown diner where you barely make enough to survive?" Her stomach twisted. "How did he—" "I did my research," he answered, before she could even ask. "Your situation is less than ideal." Emily bristled. She knew she was struggling, but hearing it put so bluntly made her chest tighten. "I don't need your charity." "This isn't charity," Alexander said smoothly. "It's an opportunity. You saved my mother's life. Now I'm offering you a chance to change yours." His mother beamed. "Oh, I like her. She—" murmured under her breath. Emily hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to say no. This man wasn't just any billionaire. He was known for being ruthless, cold, and dangerously intelligent. Working for him would mean stepping into a world she didn't belong in. But then she thought about her tiny apartment, the past due bills, the nights she went to sleep hungry. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a lifeline. "What kind of job?" she finally asked. A ghost of a smile crossed Alexander's lips. "Personal assistant. You'll be working directly under me." Emily's stomach flipped. That sounded dangerous. "And what exactly would I have to do?" she asked warily. "Whatever I need," he said simply. "Scheduling, organizing, handling my affairs." Emily's heartbeat quickened. Working so closely with him, the idea sent a shiver down her spine. She should say no, she knew she should, but against all logic she found herself nodding. Okay, I'll do it. Alexander's smirk widened, ever so slightly. Good choice, Miss Carter. And just like that, Emily's life was no longer her own. Emily had never been inside a building so grand. The Blackwell Enterprises headquarters stood like a fortress of glass and steel, towering over the city, like an untouchable empire. As she stepped into the lobby, she felt completely out of place. The floor gleamed beneath her scuffed shoes, and the scent of wealth, expensive cologne, fresh leather, and power hung heavy in the air. Men and women in tailored suits moved with purpose, barely sparing her a glance. She tugged at her second hand, blazer feeling every bit like the outsider she was. "What am I doing here?" she muttered under her breath. The doors to the private elevator dinged open, and a deep voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You're late." Emily turned and found herself staring into Alexander Blackwell's piercing blue eyes. Her breath hitched. The man was unfairly attractive, tall, commanding, exuding an aura of absolute control. Dressed in a crisp black suit, he looked like he belonged to a different world, and maybe he did. Emily squared her shoulders. "It's 8:59. His lips twitched as if amused. "And I asked you to be here at 8:50. Oh, so this was how it was going to be. Wordlessly, he turned and stepped into the private elevator. Emily followed, the doors closing behind them. Now she was alone with him. "You're my assistant." "Now," Alexander said smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks, "which means your job is to anticipate my needs before I even say them." Emily arched an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerously close to mind reading." He smirked. "Then I hope you learn fast." The elevator dinged again, opening up to a breathtaking executive floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a stunning view of the city, and at the center of it all sat his office, a sleek, intimidating space that screamed power. "First rule," Alexander said as he walked ahead of her, "never be late again." Emily bit her tongue. "Second rule," he continued, "I don't tolerate incompetence. If I ask for something, I expect it done immediately." Emily inhaled deeply. "Understood." He stopped and turned to face her fully. "And third," his gaze darkened, something almost dangerous flickering in his expression, "never lie to me." Emily's stomach flipped. "I don't lie." Alexander held her stare for a long moment. Then, seemingly satisfied, he nodded. "Good, let's get to work." And just like that, she was thrown into the chaos of his world. For the rest of the day, Emily barely had a moment to breathe. Calls, meetings, schedules. Alexander ran his empire like a flawless machine, and she was expected to keep up. She made mistakes, of course she did, but every time she thought she'd get yelled at, Alexander simply watched her with that unreadable look, as if she were some puzzle he was trying to figure out. By the end of the day, Emily was exhausted. But as she gathered her things, Alexander's voice stopped her. "Wait." She turned. "Yes?" He studied her for a moment, then said, "You impressed me today." Emily blinked. Had she heard? "That right?" "I did." A small smirk played on his lips. "Don't get too excited. You still have a long way to go." She rolled her eyes. "Of course." But as she left the office that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped onto a dangerous path, and she had no idea where it would lead her. The days at Blackwell Enterprises turned into a blur of work, pressure, and Alexander Blackwell's piercing gaze that seemed to follow Emily everywhere. She had expected him to be arrogant, cold, ruthless, and he was. But what she hadn't expected was how much more there was beneath the surface. There were moments, fleeting but real, when his carefully built walls cracked. Moments when Emily saw a man who was tired, burdened and haunted by something unseen, and she was starting to wonder who he really was beneath the billionaire facade. One evening, long after the office had emptied, Emily was still at her desk, sorting through Alexander's files. He had given her a ridiculous workload, and she was determined not to fail. She didn't hear him come in. "You're still here?" Emily jumped, turning to find Alexander leaning against the doorway of his office, his suit jacket discarded, his tie slightly loosened. He looked different. Less like a CEO, more like a man. "I had work to finish," she said, trying to sound unaffected. Alexander studied her, his gaze unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he walked over to his private bar, poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed her one. Emily hesitated. "Is this a test?" A small smirk curved his lips. "Do you always assume the worst of me? You don't exactly have a reputation for kindness." He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Fair point." Emily took the glass, watching him carefully. "Why are you being nice to me?" Alexander exhaled, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. For a moment, he looked almost human. "You're different," he said finally. "Most people want something from me. You don't." Emily frowned. "I don't understand. You offered me $500,000 the first time we met. I should have taken it, right?" His expression darkened. "That's exactly why I can't figure you out." A strange tension settled between them. Emily's heart pounded. Then suddenly Alexander's phone rang, shattering the moment. He picked it up, his expression shifting from intrigue to something much colder. "Handle it," he said sharply before hanging up. Emily narrowed her eyes. "Trouble?" Alexander hesitated, then sighed. "There are things in my world you wouldn't understand, Emily." She set her glass down. "Try me." He gave her a long, considering look. Then, in a voice that was lower, more dangerous than she had ever heard, he said, "Someone is trying to destroy me." Emily's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "I have enemies. Powerful ones. And they're coming for me." Emily swallowed hard. "What does that have to do with me?" His eyes locked onto hers. "Because now you're in the middle of it." Her heart pounded. This was more than a job, more than an arrogant billionaire. With a cold heart, she had just stepped into a world she wasn't prepared for, and there was no turning back. Emily's stomach twisted. She wasn't supposed to be part of this. When she had taken the job, she thought she would be fetching coffee, scheduling meetings, and dealing with Alexander's impossible demands, not getting dragged into some high-stakes war between billionaires. But now, she was in the middle of it, and Alexander Blackwell, the ruthless, unreadable CEO, had just admitted that someone wanted to destroy him. Emily took a slow breath. "Why are you telling me this?" Alexander leaned back, his piercing gaze locked onto hers. "Because you're in danger now too." Her blood ran cold. "What?" His voice was controlled, but there was something dark beneath it. "You work for me, Emily, and that means you're a target." She shook her head. This wasn't happening. She was just an ordinary girl, a nobody. "No one would care about me," she said, trying to convince herself. Alexander's jaw tightened. "That's where you're wrong." Then he pulled something out of his pocket and slid it across the table. A photo. Emily felt the air leave her lungs. It was her. A picture of her walking home, taken from a distance. The timestamp in the corner showed it was from last night. She barely managed to whisper, "Who took this?" Alexander's expression was like stone. "My enemies. They're watching you." Emily's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. "But why?" He hesitated, just for a second, then he finally said, "Because they think you're important to me." Silence. Emily's breath caught. Important to him. She opened her mouth to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but then she remembered the way he looked at her sometimes, like he was trying to figure her out, like she wasn't just another employee, and suddenly she wasn't sure what to say. Before she could speak, the office doors burst open. A man in a dark suit stormed in, his expression grim. "Sir, we have a problem." Alexander stood immediately, his entire demeanor shifting into something sharp and lethal. "Talk." The man hesitated, glancing at Emily. "Say it," Alexander ordered. The man's voice was urgent. "We have a mole. Someone inside Blackwell Enterprises has been feeding information to your competitors. They know everything." Emily's stomach dropped. Alexander's expression darkened, his entire body going tense. "Who?" The man swallowed. We're still tracking it, but the leak started 3 days ago. Emily stiffened. 3 days ago? That was when she had started working here. Her pulse pounded as a terrifying thought hit her. Do they think it's me? She turned to Alexander, expecting him to dismiss the idea immediately. But instead he was staring at her, his expression unreadable, calculating. Emily's breath hitched. He doesn't trust me. The realization stung more than it should have. Alexander, she whispered, you don't think I don't know what to think, he interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. Pain twisted in her chest. After everything, he still thought she could betray him. She wanted to fight back, to make him believe her. But before she could, the man beside him spoke again. There's more, he said. The people after you. They made their first move. Alexander's jaw clenched. What move? The man exhaled. They bought out your biggest investor this morning. If we don't act fast, Blackwell Enterprises is going down. Emily's heart stopped. Everything Alexander had built, his empire, his entire life, was about to be destroyed. And in that moment, she made a decision. It didn't matter that he doubted her. It didn't matter that he was cold, impossible, and sometimes infuriating. She wasn't going to let him fall. Emily straightened. Tell me what I can do. Alexander's sharp gaze snapped to her. What? She lifted her chin. I may not be rich or powerful or experienced, but I'm not useless. You said I'm already in danger, so let me help. Something flickered in his eyes, something that looked a lot like surprise. Then, slowly, a smirk curved his lips. You really are something else, Emily Carter. And just like that, she became more than his assistant. She became his only ally in the fight of his life. But what neither of them knew was that the real betrayal hadn't happened yet. And when it did, it would change everything, forever.